The Imperium of Man is not fascist. But surprisingly, this is by many considered a controversial statement, despite it becoming quite apparent the moment one delves into even the most superficial aspects of imperial governance that it is not a fascist state. To start with, the Imperium is not even a dictatorship. Most of the high-level decisions are made by a conclave of 12 High Lords. Made up of representatives of the various arms of imperial governance, it is this body, via a process of discussions, deliberations and voting, that determines the course of the Imperium. Beneath the High Lords there is a further gathering called the Senatorum Imperialis. This consists of tens of thousands of representatives and dignitaries from across imperial space. Its general purpose is much the same as that of the High Lords: to discuss and determine the best course of action for the Imperium, but this body is no longer in widespread usage. It used to be one of the primary governing bodies of the Imperium during the time of the Emperor, but after his ascension to the Golden Throne, it has been used less and less. It is still a significant political force, and many of its more high-ranking members have a lot of political power within the Imperium, but not as much as in the heydays of the Senatorum. The closest thing the Imperium has to the position of dictator would be that of Imperial Regent, a traditionally temporary position that draws its authority from the God Emperor, and as such, naturally, has no true inherent authority of its own. Indeed, even the High Lord's power stems from the Emperor. They are the ones who interpret his will, the will of the deity. If that makes them fascist dictators, then the Catholic Pope has some explaining to do. Rather than fascist, it seems quite clear that the Imperium is far closer to a theocratic oligarchy, where all true power is held in the hands of the few, who in turn justify their holding of that power by the divine will of the deity, a god, in this case, the God Emperor. And speaking of Big E himself, he is not a dictator either, simply because he is unable to be. He cannot communicate or guide the Imperium in any direct fashion, if at all. The only possible means of communication would be through visions or prophecies, and since they are generally received by a single individual, they are also unverifiable. It could be a vision, it could be a fevered dream, or simply a lie told by the few with which to rule the many. There is no way to know. And as such, the Emperor, in this case, is far closer to a traditional deity than he is a dictator. And, by the way, even when the Emperor was around in person, he was quite the strange dictator, quotation marks, as he left most of the day-to-day running of the Imperium to the Administratum and the Senatorum Imperialis, which, as mentioned, was far more powerful under the Emperor than it is today. The Emperor even went so far as to hand over supreme command of the Great Crusade to his favoured son Horus, and the running of the Imperium to Malcador and his creation, the Administratum, his army of bureaucrats. For a dictator, he sure was liberal with handing out the reins of power, wasn't he? I mean, how many dictators have you heard of that willingly relinquished power? They are few and far between. And yet, despite this, a lot of people still seem to think that the Imperium is fascist. So why is this? I believe there are three main reasons which we're going to be exploring in depth during the course of this video, and feel free to reference any of this if you get into the discussion yourself. Number 1. Imagery and lack of knowledge about said imagery. Number 2. Most people have no idea what fascism is. And I am not exaggerating here. If you go to Wikipedia, you will find no less than 22 different definitions of fascism. It doesn't help either that a lot of people simply confuse authoritarian regimes with fascist ones, thinking them to be one and the same. And 3, because the writers said so. Someone somewhere said the Imperium was fascist, and that it was meant to be a satire. Well, someone somewhere wrote that land raiders can transform into razorbacks, and back again. In fact, I would highly recommend reading any book about the Eldar authored by C.S. Goto, and then repeat that argument. But let us move on with the first and easiest one, shall we? The architectural style and appearance of the Imperium. The skulls are reminiscent of the Totenkopf, the Aquila reminiscent of the Reichsadler, and the dark, oppressive Gothic style of imperial buildings. Not to mention, of course, the deathcore of Krieg. These things are perceived by many as Nazi symbols and imagery. This perception, incorrect as it is quite widespread. The Totenkopf, for example, was first introduced in the Prussian military in the 1800s, and that's just German usage. It was utilized by the Luftwaffe, by the Waffen-SS, and by SS concentration camp guards. It was also used by the British, the Italians, the Australians, the Americans, and so on, not to mention, of course, that the usage of a skull and crossbones, that's been going on for probably about as long as there's been humans able to recognize the significance of a dead man's skull. Equally ubiquitous is the Reichsadler, itself originating in the Roman imperial eagle, and, well... using an eagle and double-headed one for imperial iconography, that's been going on for a few thousand years as well. Hell, even the Weimar Republic, a state that one could probably say was the complete opposite of the fascist state that followed it, used the single-headed Reichsadler as its coat of arms. As for the Gothic architecture, it's actually French, originating in the 1100s and then spreading to Germany in the early 1200s. It would later be utilized in churches all across Europe. And the deathcore? Well, their closest comparison to Nazi Germany is the fact that, well, there is a German word in their name, Krieg, and they used Stahlhelms, introduced for general issue, by the way, in 1916, so it is a thin link at best. These are not uniquely fascist things, and their usage in imagery or architecture does not suggest much, if anything, about a nation's political leanings. But through media and imagery, many draw a subconscious connection between these things and Nazi Germany. This is why this is the easy one to explain, because the moment you bring these things up, the vast majority of people will think, no, you are right. That was me drawing a subconscious comparison between them, and therefore going, okay, well, if this thing is this, then that other thing that looks like it must also be that. That's an entirely normal and understandable human thing to do. But then we get to the big one, the complicated one. What is fascism? It is not a straightforward answer. Incidentally, it is also the first question I would suggest asking anyone who thinks the Imperium is fascist. Because I pretty much guarantee that for each person you ask that question, you will get a slightly different answer from each and every one of them. And to demonstrate this, let us have a look at a few of the 22 different variations available on Wikipedia alone. Let us begin by a definition given by a fascist, Sergio Panunzio, because I think his definition is going to surprise quite a lot of people. He believed that fascism was a nationalistic variant of syndicalism. Syndicalism was a rather extreme at the time form of revolutionary socialism. At a time where Marxism was still primarily focused on reforming the state from the inside out, the syndicalists wished to wipe away the idea of states entirely, in favor of a federal economic organization of the society and a post-capitalist world. They were, in all due essentiality, whilst oversimplifying a little bit, revolutionary communists. So here we have a fascist stating that the definition of fascism is a variant on socialism. Interesting. But how did he think that it differed? Because I already mentioned, of course, that syndicalists wish to essentially get rid of the state, whilst the fascists, nothing could be further away from their minds. Sergio was essentially of the opinion that whilst syndicalism was on the correct path, it was limiting itself too much. It was focusing on local action and worker strikes in an attempt to essentially overthrow the state, whereas Sergio wanted to make syndicalism a part of the state. He would not merely seize the means of production, he would seize the means of state power, and through it, seize the means of production. It was a rather, well, to put it somewhat bluntly, more realistic take on socialism, more utilitarian. Instead of simply taking the leap from a strike to the perfect socialist superstate, the socialists would aim at taking control of the state and then use its power to rebuild society in a way that pleased them. As far as definitions go, this one is too vague. It leans too heavily on syndicalism and does not take into account enough of the more fascistic leanings of the ideology. And so, it's not a great one. It gives you an interesting insight into the thought of the fascists at the time, but I don't believe that what he was describing was, to rip off the communists, true fascism. Another quite fascinating definition is by another Italian, Umberto Eco. He created a list of 14 points that he himself stated could not be made into a coherent system, but that having just one of these points could coagulate into fascism. This is one of my personal favourites because he paints with a brush so broad there is hardly any ideology that isn't fascist. Listen to a few of these and you'll see what I mean. Newspeak. Fascism employs and promotes an impoverished vocabulary in order to limit critical reasoning. So, modern SJWs then, who have successfully made it illegal to use certain words or sentences lest you be convicted of hate crimes. And of course, another facet of newspeak, in the Orwellian sense of it, is the invention of new words to take the place of the old bad words. For example, by coming up with a wide variety of gender pronouns, and then enforcing penalties if you choose not to use them to the liking of those in power. Fear of difference. So countries like China, Japan, Israel, Poland, South Korea, and the entirety of the Middle East, judging by how often they are at war with one another or just flat out themselves, are also all fascists. Well, at least I can agree with one of those. Disagreement is treason. The communists have purged more people for intellectual disagreements or simply for being the wrong class of people than any other ideology on Earth. Numbers vary considerably due to the nature of the Soviet Union, but it is estimated that under the rule of Stalin, tens of millions of people were flat out purged. One of the most well-known examples would probably be the treatment of the Kulak peasants. Over the course of dekulakization, over 1.8 million kulaks were deported to so-called labor camps, and the total number of deaths, again this being Soviet numbers, ranged between 530,000 to 5 million. And that's, of course, before we get to the Red Terror after the revolution, Stalin's various purges, the famines, what happened to the Crimean Tatars, and, of course, that's just the Soviet Union. We could move on to Mao, which some scholars believe had an even higher body count than Stalin, but I think I've made my point. And the last part that Umberto Eco thinks can coagulate into fascism is probably my favourite out of them all. Appeal to a frustrated middle class. Every politician who has ever appealed to the middle class is a fascist. Suddenly, the majority of politicians are fascists. Umberto's list is a good example of the too broad to be of use definition. He takes the various component parts and presents them all as equally fascist, regardless of their use in other ways. And of course, we have the communist definitions, who basically all universally try to paint fascism as an aspect of capitalism. In my opinion, this has less to do with any true belief that fascism is capitalist, it isn't, and more to do with desperately trying to separate Marxism and wider socialism from fascism. Because the two ideologies share a frightening number of similarities, which is not too surprising, because Mussolini, the inventor, quote-unquote, of fascism, was a socialist first, and adopted many of its ideas and principles, and Hitler outright declared himself a socialist in opposition to capitalism. Indeed, I have a quote from the speech where he made that declaration, which you'll be getting to hear very, very soon. And now that we are moving away from various people's definitions of fascism to trying to figure out for ourselves what fascism is, I will have several quotes read to you by a bunch of my friends. So thanks a lot to Sargon, V, Kosaboom, and Wilhelm for adding in a little bit of extra spice to the video. And there will of course be links to the YouTube channels of those who have YouTube channels anyway, down in the description below. So, let us start with an excerpt from a speech made by Adolf Hitler in 1927.
We are socialists. We are enemies of today's capitalistic economic system for the exploitation of the economically weak, with its unfair salaries, with its unseemly evaluation of a human being according to wealth and property instead of responsibility and performance. And we are all determined to destroy this system under all conditions.
Now, fascism was a hint more capitalist than communism, whose basic economic theory was the seizure of the means of production, a economic theory they carried out with great relish. Fascism, on the other hand, in theory allowed for an open market with private property and the ownership of businesses, but not by much. Another quote by Adolf puts it quite well.
Why need we trouble to socialize banks and factories? We socialize human beings.
Hitler was all for the open, quote-unquote, market, recognizing that people work the hardest for what they themselves have created or invented. But the freedom of the market was entirely dependent on the correct nature of the person partaking in it. The moment a business or person no longer served the need of the state, or even worse, came to be in opposition to the state, then the business would be nationalized, because it no longer served the greater good. This way of economics has a hell of a lot more in common with the planned economy of the communist Soviet Union than it does with the capitalist United States of America. There is also a false quote erroneously attributed to Mussolini that gets brought up when trying to tie fascism to capitalism.
Fascism should more properly be called corporatism because it is a merger of state and corporate power.
This quote supposedly comes from La Dottrina del Fascismo, written by Giovanni Gentile as a breakdown of the doctrine of fascism. However, the quote is not in that text, nor have I been able to find any other secondary sources stating that it was Mussolini who said this. The quote in and of itself appears to be a flat-out fabrication. Presumably, it was created as an abbreviated version trying to sum up Mussolini's stance, but got some key facts incorrect, because something that Mussolini did say is the following.
The corporate state considers that private enterprise in the sphere of production is the most effective and useful instrument in the interest of the nation. In view of the fact that private organization of production is a function of national concern, the organizer of the enterprise is responsible to the state for the direction given to production. State intervention in economic production arises only when private initiative is lacking or insufficient, or when political interests of the state are involved. This intervention may take the form of control, assistance, or direct management.
This quote makes a lot of things far more clear. Essentially, Mussolini and Hitler both agreed that private enterprise was a fine and dandy thing that ended in better productivity overall, but only so far that it serves the state. And when Mussolini mentions the corporate state, he does not mean corporations in the modern sense of the word. Rather, he is referring to a version of syndicalism that is known as corporatism. This is, again, not private corporations, but rather state corporations. It itself, syndicalism that is, being an offshoot of revolutionary Marxism. This means that instead of there being private corporations, there would be a state corporation. One for science, one for military, one for mining, fishing, etc., etc. Basically, what we're talking about is state-run departments or ministries whose job it is to oversee these various sectors and step in and override private initiative where it is found lacking. Another example that makes this yet clearer is during Mussolini's inaugural speech, where he said,
"The National Council of Corporations is to the Italian economy what the staff is in the armed forces, the thinking brain, which prepares and coordinates."
So, in conclusion, fascism is not capitalism. Duh. But we have yet to answer the all-important question, what is fascism? As I am sure you have come to realize by now, that question is a lot harder to answer than one may think. This is primarily because of two factors. The first is that fascism was, from the very inception, intended to be a loose and malleable idea, one of action and realism rather than principle or ideal. I would like to read to you an excerpt here from The Philosophic Basis of Fascism by Giovanni Gentile. Quoting, "Fascism is not a philosophy. Much less is it a religion. It is not even a political theory which may be stated in a series of formulae. The significance of fascism is not to be grasped in special theses which it from time to time assumes. When on occasion it has announced a program, a goal, a concept to be realized in action, fascism has not hesitated to abandon them when in practice these were found to be inadequate or inconsistent with the principle of fascism. Fascism has never been willing to compromise its future. Mussolini has boasted that he is a tempista, that his real pride is in good timing. He makes decisions and acts on them at the precise moment when all the conditions and considerations which makes them feasible and opportunities are properly matured. This is a way of saying that fascism returns to the most rigorous meaning of Mazzini's thought and action, whereby the two terms are so perfectly coincident that no thought has value which is not already expressed in action. The real views of the Duce are those which he formulates and executes at one and the same time." End quote. In other words, in other less long-winded words, fascism is whatever the dictator in the form of the state says it is and needs it to be at that given point in time to fulfill the state's goals and ideals, in what appears at the time to be the most rational and expedient way possible. To demonstrate this, let us look at Mussolini. He was originally the most radical and rabid kind of socialist you could possibly imagine. While working as the editor of the socialist newspaper Avanti, he wrote several pieces urging a revolution now and at any cost. But after having spent almost a decade and a half in the Socialist Party, nothing had happened. The revolution was no closer to realization, and eventually Mussolini realized that it was not coming. Mussolini went on to create several groups of his own, so-called fasci, the meaning of which can be translated as bundles, or perhaps more correctly, given the circumstances, as groups or leagues, assuming I didn't butcher the pronunciation, which I probably did. His new platform was still a revolution now, but it was to be a revolution of the league, of the group. And eventually, they took on the famous name fascist, both from the word fasci and from the Roman fasces. And the key difference between the socialist Mussolini once was and the fascist he had become was action. No more talking about revolution, it was all about creating the revolution. The fascists would take to the streets and attack their political opposition. They would wear uniforms and march to demonstrate both their strength and popular support. And they were utterly unapologetic about it. When their opponents complained about clear and uncontrolled fascist violence, the fasci would simply shout back, "Me ne frego, I don't care."
The socialists ask what is our program? Our program is to smash the heads of the socialists.
This was the revolution Mussolini had so vocally called for, and which socialism had failed so miserably to produce. And in 1922, it culminated in the March on Rome, that placed Mussolini in charge of the Italian state. Incidentally, this too is the reason why fascism rose to power in the first place. In a time of revolutionary ideals sweeping through Europe, the socialists had promised revolution time and time again, but never delivered. In the words of ye old Adolf,
"I have learned a great deal from Marxism, as I do not hesitate to admit. The difference between them and myself is that I have really put into practice what these peddlers and pen pushers have timidly begun. The whole of National Socialism is based on it. National Socialism is what Marxism might have been if it could have broken its absurd and artificial ties with a democratic order."
And Mussolini as well had grown disillusioned with Marxist socialism, denouncing it as
Socialism is a fraud, a comedy, a phantom, a blackmail.
Mussolini had decided that the socialist ideal of communism, where the entirety of humanity all worked together in a perfect, harmonious cooperative system, rid of all class and inequality, where everyone was a perfect equal, was impossible. Shocking, I know. Mussolini and the fascists at the time argued that such a world simply did not take into account the human condition.
There is no revolution that can change the nature of man.
Fascism, first and foremost, concerned itself with the nation and its people, whereas International Socialism argued for a global workers' revolution, as Marx put it in his manifesto.
Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have the world to win. Working men of all countries, unite.
Amusingly enough, early fascism was a lot less belligerent than international socialism. Least they only wanted control of their own country. Marx wanted world domination. But though his goals may have been slightly less ambitious, Mussolini still wanted to create what he viewed as the perfect world. A world he could only create through absolute state control. Which finally leads us to the closest thing we are ever likely to come to a definition of fascism. All within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. These are Mussolini's and fascism's three core principles, without which the idea of the fascist state of action would be impossible. It is the core upon which the rest of the ideology rests, and it is inherently and naturally nationalistic. It is the totalitarian state above all. Not an ideology, not a religion, not a moralistic worldview. It is the state, the nation, and the group, as defined by the dictator at the time, which reigns supreme. And so this shall be our definition of fascism, because any other aspect of fascism, any other detail or offspin, all rests upon these three core principles. I will, however, have a quick side note on the racist aspect of fascism, because many are of the opinion that racism was inherent in the fascist ideology, and that it was so in such a way as to be nearly a unique aspect of fascism, and therefore inseparable from it if we are looking for a definition. This I believe, however, to be incorrect. Fascism had a racist aspect, absolutely, but the fascist definition of race is an interesting one. Mussolini changed his stance on the question of race several times over the course of his rule, with the most fascinating take probably being...
Race. It is a feeling, not a reality. 95%, at least, is a feeling. Nothing will ever make me believe that biologically pure races can be shown to exist today. National pride has no need of the delirium of race.
If you were to leave out the last part of that, national pride has no need of the delirium of race, does that not sound like something you would hear out of the mouths of a far lefty today? I mean, if you were to quote the first part of that directly to an SJW, and they didn't know the context, do you not think they would applaud that quote? Because I'm pretty sure they would. Now, of course, this is not to say that the fascists were not racist, absolutely not. Mussolini himself introduced a wide array of racist laws, or so-called race laws, to Italy. But it is important to point out that the core of fascism was still the group and the nation, and these things would on occasion supersede the idea of race. For example, the Waffen-SS, the military arm of the Nazi Party, had both a Muslim division, the 13th Mountain Division, also known as the Handschar, and an Indian formation called the Indian Legion. The SS also recruited liberally from Soviet prisoners of war and in the occupied Soviet territories, many of which were not overly fond of their previous occupiers. There were also the so-called honorary Aryans, the most famous example probably being Eduard Bloch, who was an Austrian Jew that Hitler extended the title of honorary Aryan to protect him. In reality, whilst the fascist states were absolutely racist, they were also consummate utilitarians, and those who could be of use to the state were given cynical protection so that they could continue to be of use. Additionally, we should also mention that racism was hardly a rarity in those days. Even nearing the end of the Second World War, black servicemen in the US Army were confined to their own formations, and used almost exclusively for logistical or construction duties. And as for anti-Semitism, surely you can't have a definition of fascism without that, right? Well, anti-Semitism was also extremely common. Marx famously wrote a book titled On the Jewish Question, where amongst other zingers he wrote,
What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. Money is the jealous god of Israel, in face of which no other god may exist.
And finally, on the topic of the ethnic cleansing and the concentration camps, they were of course all horrible crimes against humanity, but they were not uniquely fascist concepts. Indeed, the Soviets and the Communists in general carried out widespread ethnic cleansing which claimed the lives of millions. They also famously had their own concentration camps in the form of labor camps and the infamous Gulag. And so, I do not believe that the fascist state's particular views on race, or even on anti-Semitism, can be utilized for a true definition of fascism, because they would once again dilute the concept. Both racism and anti-Semitism were far from unusual at the time, and were present in several other ideologies. And that returns us once again to what I believe to be the best definition of fascism, the three principles. All within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. So, now that we have finally arrived at a decent definition of fascism, how does this measure up with the Imperium of Man? Well, the Imperium fails all three of these. We will start, of course, with the first point, all within the state. Sectors, subsectors, and even individual planets and systems all have extensive self-rule, and in the vast majority of cases, the only direct control enacted upon these planets, systems, or subsectors by the Imperium is the collection of predetermined tithes, be they in men, materiel, or other services and resources. This is an extraordinarily hands-off system of control, closer to feudalism than fascism, and so it fails all within the state. Moving on, we then have nothing outside the state. The Adeptus Mechanicus is an entirely separate entity to the Imperium, bound by alliances and treaties, and has on several occasions pursued a course of action quite separate from, and on occasion, contrary to and actively detrimental to, the will of terror. Clearly, therefore, the Imperium fails the nothing outside the state point. And 3. Nothing against the state. The Imperium has several organizations that compete with the state for power. The Ministorum exists almost as a separate state entirely, with its own rules, regulations, and a capital planet, Ophelia 7. They no longer have their own standing army, but they did used to. And then, of course, there is the Inquisition, which operates entirely outside of the state's power, able to requisition and control any aspect of the state for any reason and for any length of time, as they draw their authority directly from the deity himself. And of course, there is also the Adeptus Mechanicus, which, as mentioned, have on quite a few occasions gone against the will of terror. And thusly, the Imperium, being a highly decentralized state, also fails the third point. And that leaves us with 0 out of 3. Not a great statistic if you wanted the Imperium to be fascist. But let us look at a couple other things as well that are not inherently fascist, but that are definitely tied to fascism. This will also allow us to explore the third reason why the Imperium is thought to be fascist, because the writer said so. Let us start with the fact that the Imperium is an authoritarian state. The fact that a state is authoritarian does not automatically make it fascist, but the two are frequently confused. And the Imperium absolutely is authoritarian. It does have the occasional piece of democracy here and there. As mentioned, the individual planets are allowed to rule themselves however they wish, as long as they pay the Imperium's tithes. And we also have some examples of democratic voting within the larger organizations of the Imperium, such as inquisitorial conclaves. But by and large, the Imperium is authoritarian. A theocratic oligarchy, as I like to call it, where most, if not all, of the decisions, and certainly the important ones, will be made for the few, with very little input or regard for the many. In fascism, the idea of an authoritarian state is not merely necessary, it is the key fundament upon which the entire ideology rests. You cannot have fascism without an authoritarian state. But the Imperium appears to be different. There is nothing apparent within the Imperium's doctrine or way of governance that suggests that authoritarianism is a key ideological component of the Imperium. And I say this because of the actions of the Emperor, who seemingly was attempting to delegate as much power as possible away from himself and into the hands of more and more individuals. First with Horus, then with Malcador, then with the Administratum and the Senatorum Imperialis, and so on. He also had set up his sons to rule the galaxy in his stead, in various positions and with various specialities. And already during the Imperium's expansionist phase, it gave control of newly conquered planets to planetary governors, who then had extensive self-rule. This does not appear to fit in with the three core principles of fascism. It was still an oligarchy, absolutely. Perhaps, if we were to be optimistic, an oligarchy in the process of trying to reform itself into a republic, possibly. Maybe the Emperor was even trying to recreate the old human federation. Who knows? But regardless of what the Emperor's intentions were, it was not, it would appear, to create a fascist state. The modern-day Imperium is not authoritarian because it is fascist. It is authoritarian because it wishes to survive. And in an extraordinarily hostile galaxy, the likes of which we see in 40k, where the Imperium is beset by countless alien species on all sides, along with the continuous growing internal threat of chaos, democratic rule would never do. Imagine the complete and utter chaos of holding a democratic election in 40k. Where the only means of communication over extraordinarily long distances is astropathic communication, an art that is heavily based upon interpretation even at the best of times. Not to mention the numbers of votes. There would be trillions upon trillions upon trillions, and all of this data would then have to be processed. Then all of the representatives would have to be gathered in one area, lest yet further astropathic communication be necessary with yet further interpretation. And then the various minutiae of the Imperium must be voted on and deliberated on, and then the decisions need to then be communicated. In the modern-day Imperium, where most local decisions are made on the local level and only the highest level decisions are sent to a conclave of 12 individuals, this process can already take weeks, if not months. The gears of the Administratum turn slowly. Imagine how much slower they would turn if there were billions upon billions upon billions of democratically elected representatives who all needed their say. Reaching any kind of consensus, or hell, even a majority, I imagine would be a completely and utterly Sisyphean task. For the Imperium, being authoritarian is not so much an ideological or moral or philosophical choice as much as it is one of pure simple survival. And so with that handled, let us move on to another thing that is often linked together with fascism: militarism. The admiration of the fighting man and romanticization of war was a common theme in both German and Italian fascism. Hardly surprising, since both were led by men who had served during the First World War, and considered that experience to be a formative one, both for themselves and for the nation, as they both felt that their nations had been betrayed during the war. This perceived betrayal and the unjust peace was also used by both nations as justification for many of their expansionist policies, which were in turn firmly grounded in the three principles. All within the state led to programs of repatriation in Germany. Nothing outside the state led to demands for annexation of territory that the parties felt belonged to them after the unjust peace. Danzig and Corfu, for example, and nothing against the state led to war in Ethiopia, where previously the Italians, as the only European power in history, had lost a war to an African nation. A slight to the nation's honour that had to be corrected. There are some similarities here to the Imperium, at least in superficial terms of an expansionist militaristic regime. The Imperium expanded into the stars to reclaim what it viewed as its birthright, its lost territories. And in the modern-day Imperium, the soldier and the warrior are certainly glorified and romanticized. For example, in massive cathedral stained-glass windows depicting the god Empress Astartes, and propaganda is of course also rife through most imperial worlds. But again, the Imperium's reasons are quite different from those of the fascist nations of our own timeline. The Imperium began its crusade to reconquer lost territories just like many other species had done before them. Conquest and loss is no more than a natural part of the 41st millennium, and the ultimate goal of the Emperor was grander still: the eradication of chaos from the galaxy. And in the 41st millennium, the propaganda and glorification once again seems to be more for the sake of survival rather than for ideological reasons. Any state in a time of all-out war will utilize propaganda and via it the glorification of the soldier, simply because the nation needs soldiers, and so will use any means at its disposal to acquire them. And once again, this is by no means a uniquely fascist thing. Even our modern-day democratic militaries utilize propaganda, for example in the form of recruitment posters, extolling the virtues of military service, getting an education, getting a taste for leadership, and so on and so on. And whilst we are on the topic of militarism, I also want to touch a little bit upon the idea of military rule. Now, the Imperium as a whole is not under military rule, as we've already touched upon, but some planets are. This again is where things get a little bit complicated, because the Imperium is so vast that there is pretty much an example of anything and everything. Due to the considerable degrees of self-rule that planets are afforded, there are planets out there that could be considered pretty damn liberal when it comes to the rights of its citizens, whilst there are other worlds out there where the population are little more than slaves. In a similar fashion, there are also worlds out there that have universal conscription. Some worlds even have manpower as their primary export, as Krieg, for example, whilst others may have voluntary or highly selective forms of conscription. This too is something that almost certainly will evolve depending upon the situation in which the planet finds itself. If it is under direct threat of invasion, for example, you can be pretty damn certain that the conscription laws are going to be tightened. If it is entering into an economic recession, and it desperately needs to boost its working power and the wider industries of the planet, then the reverse is likely to happen, and so on and so on. Thusly, whilst the Imperium is most certainly militaristic, it does not appear as if its military is overly fascist. And if we are to get spicy in here, we can also move on to compare hatred and genocide. This is also where one of the closer comparisons to the Imperium actually exists. But first and foremost, there is a big difference between waging genocidal war against an alien species, literally bent on humanity's complete and utter annihilation, like the Tyranids, and waging war on other humans because of their religious views. But, honestly, that should be so obvious that I hardly need mention it, though for some reason I do still feel the need. So, the Imperium is genocidal. No questions about it. It would not bat an eye at the idea of exterminating entire populations of aliens. Just like the aliens would not blink so much as a tentacle at the idea of doing the exact same thing to the humans. In 40k, the moralistic question is not whether or not a hostile population should or should not be exterminated. It is whether it should or should not be enslaved first. Because in a universe like 40k, where a species' not just prosperity, but very survival depends upon the war effort, well, there is a hell of a lot less room for moralism. Or ideology. Just like the fascists were happy to compromise on occasion by recruiting Slavs to fight, or granting honorary Aryanship to certain Jews or the Japanese as a whole, the Imperium will also treat with xenospecies, even enter into more or less official treaties with them. Again, they would prefer to kill them all, but sadly that is not always an option. So, at least we managed to find one similarity. And that brings us to our final point. 40k was originally created in 1987, Rogue Trader was created in 1987, and it was quite a different beast to modern day 40k. Rogue Trader was far more satirical and jokey. It did not take itself very seriously at all. Hell, initially, 40k was meant to be a sci-fi version of Games Workshop at that time far more successful Warhammer Fantasy franchise. And so it was a far less structured and intricate universe than it would eventually develop into. As to how satirical it was, that is open to a fair bit of interpretation. For example, some would tell you that the big boy orc himself, Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka, is a satirical take on Margaret Thatcher. If it is, it's not a very good one, if I'm to be honest, as Gazgul, I don't see it myself beyond the name, I suppose, which isn't much of a satirical take, unless you think that Margaret Thatcher was an orc? I'm not entirely sure. I'm looking for some kind of clever take on her policy positions here, but I'm somewhat struggling to find one, if I'm to be honest. But hey, details. The Imperium too was depicted as a brutal authoritarian police state, which would move into areas of anarchy left behind after the Great Eye receded, the Eye of Terror, and enforce their own brutal idea of order upon the planets. And the idea of the Imperium being a pretty dang horrible place to live in, by and large, would certainly continue, but with the second edition 40k received a radical makeover, a complete overhaul, I'd probably say, in many, many ways. It became far more serious, and the jokes, whilst they were still certainly there, they were far more subdued and rare. This would continue out through the developing cycles of 40k, and the idea of 40k being fascist stems quite a lot from this very early version and the early interpretations of 40k. You will, for example, often see people stating that 40k is a satire of fascism, and perhaps it was in the Rogue Trader days, or more correctly, perhaps it was an attempt at satire of fascism. Because, as we have examined at length in this video, the modern-day Imperium does not appear to fulfill many, if practically any, of the criterias of a fascist state. Not even close, in fact. And so merely stating that it is, well, that's not really quite good enough, now is it? If you wish to make a satire of something, you require a pretty damn intricate understanding of what that thing is to make a good, solid, intricate, and interesting satire. But we should also bear in mind that, due to the fact that fascism is such a poorly defined word that has been bereft of virtually all meaning in modern-day vocabulary, it's not easy to do that. And so I imagine a lot of people do not call 40k fascist out of any ill will, although I've seen more than one leftist article that absolutely does do that. The majority of people have probably never really looked into it, and so simply assume that, well, authoritarian, therefore fascist. But as I believe I have demonstrated quite clearly in this video, that is not always the case. Indeed, authoritarian might equal communist in more than one instance. Now, I will bid you all adieu. Please do let me know what you think in the comment section down below. If you agree, if you disagree, and if you disagree, then please do tell me why, because it's always interesting to hear, of course. And please do share this video around a bit. I am begging you on this one, because I want this video to find its way into the hands of all the correct kinds of people. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.